Hello and welcome back. And today I want to do something slightly different, which is I want to show how I test drive any kind of code. In that case, it's going to be a little TypeScript library with an outside-in approach. So for you who don't know what outside-in TDD is, TDD is test-driven development. So we write a test first and then make it pass. And outside-in specifically refers to the fact that we start our tests and the interaction with our code from the most outside layer of our application that we can think of. So I've drawn a little diagram here. And in that sense, what we want to do is we want to have a test or a test file, test suite, whatever, doesn't really matter, that interacts with the most outside part of our application. In that case, it's going to be a library. And what is important about this is that we're not directly, or at least not when we drive the overall system, be interacting with the individual subcomponents. Or the way you can think about it is before you even know you have subcomponents, right? Because we want to start easy breezy. Before we have subcomponents, we start with this, and then we write more and more tests, we write more and more code within this component. And at one point we're realizing, I actually want to split out some code. And that's going to be a subcomponent. And then we realize, I actually want to split this one out and refactor some code into that part because we have identified some responsibility that should not be in this subcomponent or shouldn't be in the outside component. And what is nice about that approach is if the majority of your tests are on the very outside and very behavioral, then you can refactor within without breaking any of your tests. Sorry. That's the general idea. That does not mean that you can't have tests, that you can't have tests talking to a subcomponent. That normally happens, or I do that when, let's say I have a bigger test that tests some overall behavior, and then, so for example, a specific network response from a microservice, and then what I have is a property that can have, let's say, 5 different states. Then what I don't want to do is I normally don't want to write 5 tests on the outside because those tests are normally a little bit bigger and require more setup. But what I can sometimes do is I sometimes can then test the subcomponent and just drive out those permutations in behavior. Maybe value of a property is not a good one. Maybe it's calculating something specific, I don't know, let's say a shipping date. And I want to be able to deal with time zones and all of those things, all the problems that come with dates. Then I can write multiple tests that deal with just the problem on the subcomponent test. But to drive out the overall behavior of our system, we want to stay as far outside as we can. And the example that I want to show this with today is I'm currently working on a little library that should help with interacting with Halboy-ts RESTful endpoints. So for those of you who don't know what Halboy-ts is a specific JSON format returned by HAL services. So HAL stands for Hypermedia Application Language. And the idea is that in the response, we mostly have 2 reserved keywords. We have _links and _embedded. We're not going to worry about embedded right now. But what _links is telling us in this example that I have lifted from the official spec draft, they're talking here about an order. So this is an order that is in USD. It has a status shipped. It is a total of 1020. And in that case, it has a links block, and that links block tells us where we can go off to fetch further resources. So resources should always have a self, which is the URI that refers back to itself. And then in this example here, we would have a warehouse link. And if we're interested what is in that warehouse or what is in this invoice, for example, then we can call that URI and then get information about the invoice. And why Hull is great is because I, as a client, don't need to know that there's a /warehouse/whatever endpoint or a /invoices endpoint. All I need to know is that there is a warehouse link on the resource, and then I can just follow that. And what that allows me to do is it allows me to change where these URLs are pointing without breaking my clients, because they don't care about the specific URL. They care about this link relation is what the spec calls it, the relation here. All of this might be like a little bit much in one go, and it's actually like not too much about the pros and cons of Hull, but a little bit more about what we want to build and what we're going to try to test drive. So what I want to write is I want to write a little navigator. And what the navigator is supposed to do is it should be able to like discover a resource. So for example, in that case, this order that we have here. And then I want to be able to interact with these links in the links block. And what I mean with interact is, I want to be able to follow a link and either do a get, a post, a put, a page, whatever on it, right? Like classic HTTP verbs, methods or verbs, HTTP methods. And one thing that I want to do is I want it to be immutable, right? So the idea is that I have a navigator, I can discover something, it's going to tell me if that was successful or not, and then I can inspect the resource that I have fetched through that discover, but then I can interact with that resource and do further things. That's kind of the rough idea. I have not planned this out much further. I have used a very similar library in Clojure a lot, which is called Halboy. This is why I named that one Halboy-ts. And I'm going to quickly show you what I have done so far on this, because I've been working a little bit on that already. So what I have built so far is a class here that is called resource. And that is just a TypeScript representation of a single resource, so just like a data representation. And I've written some tests here, and those tests hopefully show how we can interact with a resource. So I just quickly want to show this. So in order to create a new resource, for example, we call resource.create, and then we can, for example, call add link or add property or add embedded. So I've like written a little bit of a DSL on top of that. And then just to quickly show, for example, it's like to JSON here. In that case, I do resource create.add link with a relation in the URI. And then I can call to JSON on it. And when I do that, then I get an expected object. In that case, it would have like this underscore links relation href on it. So really just a relatively simple DSL to create Hull JSON resources, to get properties, get links, get embedded, and it's immutable again. So the idea is that the resource.create is a different resource than when I call .addLink on it, or when I call .addLink a second time, it's going to be a new resource again. So far this is what we're working with. I think I'm just gonna dive straight in by creating a file and kind of like explaining what I want the first test to be. Well, yeah. So I am going to create a new test file here. I'm going to call this navigator.test.ts. I would like to add the Git. So navigator. And what I'm thinking is, if we go a little bit back to the drawing board, what I'm thinking is, if I have a navigator here, I want to be able to call .discover on it with a URL. And what this navigator is going to do, it's going to make an HTTP call to the server with the URL. So discover in that case is get. So I wanted to do a get of URL, and this is of course going to get a response back to here. Well, here we go. And then I want the navigator to expose what there was. So if the response, for example, is, and I think I want to start with the simplest one, which is the status code. If this is going to be 200 OK with some JSON in the body, I don't want to worry too much about it. Then what I can do is I can then say, hey, dot status, or get status, so I'm not quite sure in TypeScript all of that works, and that will say, okay, status was at 200. Maybe to show this a little bit better, I can do it. So dot discover URL. So now we can take this out of here. That's kind of the idea. So I'm going to try to write a test for that. What that means is we're going to need some form of like mock server. I already had a look around, and I think I used it before a little bit, is mock service worker. I had a quick play around with it. It seems to do what I need it to do, but I'm not very good with it yet. So we'll have to come back to this documentation a few times. And then to make the network request, I've been looking at Axios, or Axios, slightly unsure again, pronunciation. But I mean, it has 47 million weekly downloads, so can't be too bad. And the main reason is it seems to support Node.js and browser at the same time. And I kind of would like my library to be able to be used on the server side for microservice communication, service-to-service communication, but also client to server. That's the idea. So the more flexibility we can have, the happier I am. So that's for a bit of an introduction of what I want the first test to be. So we now just need to figure it out. So I think it should it's not going to return directly 200 to us, because it's going to return the navigator itself, or at least that's my idea. So you can like nicely chain interactions. So I think like status is 200 when discovering endpoint succeeds. That's kind of the idea. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to have to make this async. So, and just to figure out the 3 blocks, so the way I think about tests is I think about them in 3 parts. So there's arrange, act, assert, basically like setting up your test, doing the thing that you have to do, and then asserting the outcomes. And I often like working from asserting backwards, because that kind of like clarifies in my head what I specifically want to get out of this test. And then I can be like, okay, what do I need to call to make this work? And then I can go back and be like, okay, what do I need to set up for that to work? I hope that makes sense. So I'm going to start with expect navigator.status to strict equal 200. I think technically I don't need to strict equal here, because I'm not comparing objects. I can probably do a to be, if I remember correctly how that works. I gotta be honest, the whole like chest expectations, they sometimes confuse me. Okay, so we're gonna need a navigator. And what I want the navigator to be is I want this to be a static method on here. And this is going to need a URL. So const URL is, so my understanding is it doesn't really matter what we make this URL, because we're just going to like intercept it with mock service worker anyway. And the other thing is, why is this a static colon here, right? So the other thing that we could do is we could probably do like a new Navigator and then do a discover on it. But the way I think about it, the entry point to always creating a Navigator is by discovering a resource. And then the default constructor wouldn't be very useful. So the way to get a new Navigator is through like this static function, excuse me, the static function that will then give me a new Navigator. I don't know yet if that's a good idea. I don't know yet. Because we might want to configure the Navigator with like options in the future. For example, passing specific HTTP headers or anything like that for authentication and authorization. But yeah, I just like this more functional approach. Or like, is it more functional? I don't know. Anyway, I'm gonna trust my gut here. That's what I'm gonna do. So of course we're gonna need to create a Navigator. TypeScript. And what I like to do is I'd like to move this to the right over here so we can have them next to each other. And I'm gonna export the class Navigator. And then I'm going to make the constructor private and then a static discover looks like this. Well, URL is going to be a string. So this is not picking it up right now. So what we will have to do is we will have to import get from source index. And then in the index here, I want to export Navigator from Navigator. /. Good. Okay, replace with source index. Okay. Then close this. So what do we have here? It's saying void function return values used. Fair enough. And then the other thing that this will probably going to be is this is probably going to need an await in the future. But for now, let's run this. Now what I would like to do is I would like to run all tests. So property status does not exist on type void. That is fair enough. So the first thing we want to say is this is going to return Navigator. So I'm just going to return this for now. And now it's hopefully going to say property status does not exist on type Navigator. So we didn't make the test pass, but we have made a step forward to closer to what we care about, right? And then I'm just going to do a read-only number or undefined. Oh, and then I don't need this, do I? Right. So what is this complaining about? Property status is missing on type of Navigator, but required on Navigator. So. Okay, and now it says, of course, it is undefined. So we somehow need to be able to like set this status, right? So what we can do for now, very crudely, is this. Nope, something missing. this status is status. Okay, so this passes. Of course, that is not very exciting yet, and it's definitely not the right thing. So we will have to come up with a test that kind of like forces us to actually fetch the network call, or actually fetch from the endpoint that we're trying to discover. So what I'm thinking is I want the resource that will be returned when it is at 200. And if the resource is a property on it, that we return... No, simpler. We can do something simpler, right? We can say if our service responds with a 404, then the status will be a 404, right? And then we can't hard-code it anymore. So if we do this, and I also know that we haven't set up the server yet, because we technically don't need to, but now we will have to, and then we're gonna go back and fix that one. Well, we do it before, actually. So if we say this test is not done, we're gonna need a server. There, I think. Setup server, okay. And then what we will need is we're gonna need a before each server dot start. No, it's like a cleanup or something like that. So it's like a before all server dot start. Listen. After all server dot close. Is that how that works? Looks like it. Just provides hook callback. Okay, that should work, right? And then there is a server.use, and that's gonna need a handler. And the way these handlers work is you go like http.get, for example, and we need to get HTTP from the MSW here. And then you say which endpoint, so in that case URL, and then you give it a function of what it should respond with. And in that case, there is one for JSON. So I had it open here. There's like a HTTP response JSON. So we want to return HTTP response JSON. We want to import that. And then it looks like we need another parentheses here. So hopefully that all still runs. Okay. The only thing that I'm unsure is I think we need to clean this up. Reset handlers. Reset handlers. Are you resets request handlers to the initial list given to setup server call, which in our case is nothing. So before each server.reset handlers. All right, because we don't want any of the tests to mess with each other, right? Okay. So everything's running, everything's passing. Status is 404. When discovering endpoint fails because of not found error. I don't know about this test name. Status is 404 when discovering endpoint fails because of due to is shorter. Due to not found. Is it an error? I think so, right? Foo is considered a client error. Okay, so we want to change this. I think you can say like, give it a specific status. Body. Yeah, so comma status foo. And then we want this to be foo as well. Cool. And of course, that doesn't pass because here we always set it to 100. So we now actually need to make a get call to the endpoint. So const response is await Axios yep dot get URL. And now it's going to complain because this is not an async function. So we have to make discover async, which of course makes this a promise of Navigator and not a Navigator. And then we want to create a new Navigator with response.status. And of course, this doesn't work now because these are promises here. So we need to await the promise here. And we need to await the promise here. Okay, I did not expect that. So request failed with status code foo. So does that mean that Axios throws when it doesn't get a 200? Handling errors. Yes, so default behavior is to reject on everything that's not a 2xx. So we can try and catch that. So try catch does it say no? I am honestly not quite sure what to do with this exception here, or this error here. But what I do know is we can do this here. But then how do we get to our status? Using toJSON to get an object with more information about the HTTP error. Okay, so if we tried it, log to inspect this and then just return a new Navigator. Well, technically we could just make this a foo here, and we could just make this a 200 here, and it would be fine. No, toJSON is not a function. Okay, apparently it's toJSON. And now we get a little bit of stuff here. For example, message name, stack, line number, and I assume somewhere the status. Yes. So then error dot so that passes now. So yes, of course, we could have 200 here and not worry about the response and not worry about this here and have 400 here. But A, doesn't really work, does it? And B, it would be duplication, right? It would be data duplication between our test here, or what we expect here, and this one here. So one thing I'm considering now is we could create a function that randomly generates an HTTP error code, and then we always assert it's correct, or we do like the simpler thing right now, which would be to say status is a 500, for example, when difference due to internal server error. All right, so if we say this is a 500 here, then this needs to be a 500 here. And I know this should pass, right? Because we already have done the step from, instead of hard coding this, taking the status from here. But it, you know, it eases my mind. But this is a lot of duplication now. Well, a lot is relative, but I feel like we can do better. I feel like, can Faker do that? So can generate a status or not? Emoji, HTTP method, HTTP status codes. And this can take a type, read-only array, status code types. Informational success, client error, server error. Well, that looks like exactly what I want. So I can pass you types that is an array of client error or server error. And that is going to be our error code or status code. So and what this means is that if you haven't used Faker before, Faker is great for generating test data. So what this means is if we run this a few times, and I can show you this by just running the test, and we check the console. This was a 511. This was a 407. This was a 506. So that basically generates now HTTP codes for client error and server error. And we make sure that this is actually returned every time. So that kind of like stops us from hard coding anything in here. We have to take it from the status code. Of course, this means we need to change. Well, first of all, it means this test is superfluous because the 500 is now covered in here, so we can get rid of it. But it means that our test name is not ideal, right? So the status is the status from response when service returns client or server error. And we can take out that here. All right. Of course, that is wrong. I'm going to run all tests. Okay, awesome. I'm going to stop here. This is roughly around half an hour. I know this is not like too impressive yet, but I think it's going to, or it is setting us up, I think, quite well for a few more tests and for like driving out more of the behavior, and we want to stay on this level. But this is kind of like what we're doing right now. We're going to call discover, we're mocking our response, and then what's probably going to happen is we're going to, at some point, I assume, break out code from here, and our tests won't need to change. But we'll see when we get there. We'll see when we get there. All right, but we'll see that in the next part. Thank you very much.